Welcome. Tonight we are going to talk about an old idea called Wu Wei, effortless action, the art of accomplishing without forcing, of achieving without straining. We have been taught, most of us, our entire lives, that worth comes from effort and struggle. Tonight offers a different, older truth, that the things which matter most often arrive not through force, but through alignment, patience, and the willingness to act only when action is natural and needed. You will meet tonight a carpenter and a weaver, a smith and a navigator, a young chief and a young hunter. 13 different stories from 13 different corners of the world, each circling the same quiet question. What would it feel like to stop forcing, even for one evening, and simply let things unfold as they were always going to? Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is, where you are listening from, and whether you are a front, back, or side sleeper. There are no wrong answers here, only fellow travelers finding their way to rest. You do not need to know anything about Taoism to be here tonight. These teachings are for anyone who has ever felt the quiet exhaustion of believing that everything worthwhile must be earned through strain, and wondered if there was a gentler way to carry it. So wherever you are right now, let yourself settle in. There is nothing to figure out. There is nowhere else to be. Thank you for joining us here at the Tao at Night. Let us begin. There is an old teaching at the heart of Taoist thought called Wu Wei. It is usually translated as effortless action. But this does not mean doing nothing. It means doing only what is needed in the way it actually wants to be done, without the extra strain we add out of fear or habit. Lao Tzu wrote that the softest things in the world overcome the hardest things, not through force, through a kind of patient, attentive alignment with how things actually move. Most of us have been taught the opposite our whole lives, that worth comes from struggle, that if something is not difficult, it does not count. We measure our days by how much we have pushed against, how exhausted we are by evening, as though exhaustion itself were proof of a life well lived. Wu Wei asks us to consider a different measure entirely, not how hard you worked, but how closely your work matched what the moment actually needed. This is a quiet, almost subversive idea, in a world that so often equates worth with visible struggle. It asks us to set down, even briefly, the belief that we must constantly prove ourselves through strain. Tonight's first teaching gently questions the old assumption. What if the things that matter most were never meant to be forced at all? There was a young carpenter apprenticed to a master joiner known throughout the province for furniture that seemed to assemble itself. People said his pieces lasted generations without warping, without loosening, without the small failures that plagued ordinary furniture. The young carpenter had come to him specifically hoping to learn this secret, certain it must be some closely guarded technique passed down only to the most trusted apprentices. The young man had talent, but he struggled with one particular joint, a dovetail that needed to fit with no gap, no force, no hammering. Every attempt he made required him to pound the pieces together, and every piece he pounded together eventually split along a hidden grain line, ruined. He brought his frustration to his master one evening, holding up a cracked piece of walnut. "I have tried everything," he said. "I cut it precisely, I sand it carefully, and still I must force it together, and still it splits." The master took the broken piece in his weathered hands and turned it slowly in the lamplight. "Show me how you cut it," he said. The young man demonstrated, moving quickly, efficiently, each cut clean and exact by any measure he knew. "You are skilled," the master said, "and you are also fighting the wood." "I am not fighting it," the young man said. "I am shaping it." "Are you?" the master asked. "Or are you deciding before you even pick up the wood exactly what shape it must become, and then forcing it into that shape regardless of what the wood itself is telling you?" The young man did not understand. He had never thought of wood as telling him anything. "Bring me a fresh piece," the master said. The young man returned with another length of walnut. The master held it for a long moment, simply holding it, running his thumb along the grain before he spoke again. "Wood has a memory," he said. "It remembers which way the tree grew, which way the branches reached for light, which way the trunk twisted in long-ago winds. A joint that fights this memory will always need force. A joint that follows it needs almost none at all." "How do I know which way it remembers?" the young man asked. "You feel for it," the master said. "Not with your eyes first, with your hands. Close your eyes." The young man closed his eyes, feeling foolish, and ran his fingers along the grain the way the master had shown him. "What do you feel?" the master asked. "It's smoother in this direction," the young man said slowly, surprised. "Rougher the other way." "That is the wood's memory," the master said. "Cut with the smooth direction, and the wood will want to come together. Cut against it, and you will spend your whole life forcing joints that should have simply met." The young man opened his eyes and looked at the fresh piece differently now, as though seeing it for the first time. "I have been cutting against the grain this whole time?" he asked. "Sometimes," the master said. "Not always, but often enough to explain your splitting joints. You were so focused on precision, on the measurements, on the angles, that you forgot to ask the wood what it was willing to become." The young man sat with the broken piece in his hands a while longer, turning it over, noticing now what he had missed before. The faint telltale grain pattern that, in hindsight, had been visible the entire time, if only he had thought to look for it. "I think I have been afraid," he admitted slowly, "that if I stopped controlling every detail, my work would become sloppy. That precision and force were the only way to guarantee quality." The master considered this. "Precision matters a great deal. I'm not suggesting you abandon it. I am suggesting there are two kinds of precision. One is the precision of imposing your will exactly as planned, regardless of what the material offers. The other is the precision of perceiving exactly what the material is offering and matching your work to it completely. The second kind is harder to learn. It is also, in my experience, the only kind that produces work which truly lasts." The young man spent the following weeks relearning his craft from this new starting point. He began each piece not with his ruler, but with his hands, feeling for the grain's memory before he made a single cut. His work slowed at first, then gradually it quickened again, not because he was rushing, but because the wood was finally meeting itself without resistance. Months later, he completed a dovetail joint that required no hammer at all. He simply pressed the two pieces together, and they slid home with a soft final sound, fitting as though they had always belonged together. He brought it to his master, who turned it over once, ran his thumb along the seamless joint, and smiled. "Now you are not forcing the wood to become something," the master said. "You are helping it become what it already was." The young carpenter carried this lesson into every piece he made for the rest of his long career. He was never the fastest joiner in the province, but his furniture, people said, seemed to know its own shape, as though it had simply been waiting patiently for someone willing to listen before they cut. Many years later, he took on an apprentice of his own, a young woman every bit as eager and impatient as he had once been. He did not tell her the secret directly. He simply handed her a piece of fresh walnut, closed her eyes for her the way his own master once had, and waited for her to discover, in her own time, what her hands already knew. In the Sufi tradition of Islamic mysticism, there is a similar understanding of working with rather than against what already is. The poet Rumi often described the spiritual path not as a battle to be won through force, but as a surrender to a current already moving in the right direction. He compared the seeking heart to a reed flute, useless as a rigid stick, but capable of music once it became hollow enough to let breath move through it freely. There is a Sufi teaching about the practice of tawakkul, often translated as trust or reliance, not passivity but a working partnership with what is already unfolding, rather than a constant struggle to impose one's own will against it. A Sufi teacher might say that the carpenter's hands, once he stopped forcing the wood, were not doing less work. They were doing truer work, work aligned with what the material itself was offering, rather than work spent constantly overriding it. This is close to what the master joiner showed his apprentice. Mastery was never about overpowering the wood. It was about listening closely enough to stop needing to. There is a well-known Sufi teaching story about a man who spent years trying to dig a well in solid rock, exhausting himself with every strike of his pickaxe, until a passing dervish asked him simply, "Have you considered moving 3 steps to the left, where the rock has already begun to crack on its own?" This story is often told to illustrate a broader Sufi understanding that the universe is not indifferent to genuine effort, but it responds more readily to effort joined with attentive humility than to effort that insists, against all evidence, on a single predetermined path. Think about something in your life you have been forcing. Not necessarily a physical task. Perhaps a conversation you keep pushing toward an outcome it resists. Perhaps a plan you keep insisting on, despite signs that a different shape might fit more easily. You may have felt this yourself, the particular fatigue of working against the grain of something, again and again, certain that more force was the only answer. This shows up in ordinary life in small, familiar ways. The argument that would resolve more easily if you simply stopped pushing your point. The career path that keeps splitting under pressure, no matter how precisely you measure your next move. The relationship that finally eases the moment both people stop forcing it toward a particular shape. Like the carpenter, You may have spent years assuming precision and force were the same thing. They rarely are. The truest work is often the work that finally stops fighting what was already quietly willing to come together. Tonight, consider this gently, without judgment toward yourself for all the forcing that came before. The carpenter did not become wise overnight, and neither will you. The first step is simply noticing, with kindness, where the forcing has been happening. Not. But right now, in this breath, there is nothing to force. You do not need to push yourself towards sleep. You only need to feel, gently, which way your own brain is already moving, toward rest, toward stillness, toward exactly this moment. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a kind of planning that helps, and a kind that only adds weight. The wild goose does not draft a migration schedule months in advance, refining it, second-guessing it, lying awake over its details. It simply waits until the air itself, the light itself, the cold itself tells it the moment has arrived. Then it flies, without hesitation, without a single wasted motion. Lao Tzu observed that the sage acts without scheming and accomplishes without claiming credit. This is not a lack of intention, it is a different relationship with timing, trusting that the right moment will announce itself rather than trying to manufacture it through sheer force of will. We are taught to believe that control comes from planning every detail in advance. Wu Wei suggests something gentler, that some of our deepest competence comes not from controlling the moment, but from recognizing it when it finally arrives. Tonight's second teaching is this: not every action needs a plan. Some only need patience and a willingness to notice when the moment has already begun. There was a young hunter who had grown anxious about providing for his family through the coming winter. He spent his days mapping out elaborate strategies, which trails the deer would take, which weeks the fish would run thickest in the river. He filled his mind with calculations, certain that enough canning would guarantee enough food, enough safety, enough peace of mind. But the season did not follow his calculations. The deer moved through unexpected paths. The fish ran early one week and vanished the next. Each time his careful plans failed to match what actually happened, his anxiety deepened and his planning grew even more elaborate, even more exhausting. His grandfather, who had hunted these same lands for 60 years, watched this with quiet concern. One cold morning, before the sun had fully risen, the grandfather woke the young man and led him outside without explanation. They stood together at the edge of a wide marsh, breath visible in the grey morning air, waiting. "What are we waiting for?" the young hunter asked, already calculating how this lost time might disrupt his plans for the day. "You'll see," his grandfather said. They waited a long while in silence. The young man grew impatient, his mind drifting back to his lists, his calculations, the schedule he had built and rebuilt a dozen times that week alone. Then, without warning, the sky filled with sound. A great formation of wild geese rose from the marsh in a single fluid motion, wings beating in unison, climbing into the pale morning light. "Watch them," the grandfather said. The young man watched, momentarily forgetting his anxious calculations, caught by the sheer, unhesitating certainty of the bird's movement. "How do they know exactly when to leave?" he asked. "All at once, with no apparent signal?" "They do not decide it the way you decide things," his grandfather said. "They do not sit awake the night before weighing options. They feel the air change. They feel the day's length shifting. And when the moment is right, they simply go. No goose argues with another about whether it is truly time. They all already know." "I wish I knew things the way they know things," the young hunter admitted. "You do," his grandfather said. "You have simply stopped trusting it because you believe that knowing must come from calculation rather than attention." The young man frowned. "But if I do not plan, how will I know when to hunt, when to fish, when to gather? Surely the geese have some instinct I do not have." His grandfather considered this for a long moment, watching the last of the formation disappear over the tree line. "You have hunted these lands since you were a boy," he said. "Your body has learned things your mind has not yet given itself credit for. The way the air smells before a good hunting day, the particular quiet of the forest before the deer move through. You have always known these things. You have simply been drowning that knowing under so many lists and schedules that you can no longer hear it." "But what if I am wrong?" the young hunter asked. "What if I trust this quieter knowing, and it fails me, and my family goes hungry because I chose not to plan carefully enough?" His grandfather was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Then you will have failed honestly," he said, "rather than exhausting yourself failing anxiously. There is no guarantee in either approach. The geese sometimes misjudge a storm. Hunters sometimes misjudge a season. But a hunter who has learned to listen, even when he occasionally misjudges, recovers his footing more easily than a hunter who has only ever known how to calculate, because the listening hunter has not exhausted himself in the process of getting there." "How do I learn to hear it again?" the young man asked. "The same way the goose learns it," his grandfather said. "Not through more thinking, through more attention. Spend less time planning the hunt and more time simply being present in the place where the hunt will happen. The knowing will return, the way it always does for anyone willing to actually listen rather than constantly calculate." The young hunter took this seriously, though it felt strange at first, almost irresponsible, to set aside his careful lists in favor of simply walking the land and paying attention. Within a season, he noticed something had shifted. He still planned, but more loosely now, and far less anxiously. He began to notice subtle signs he had been too busy calculating to see before. The particular way certain birds went quiet before a storm, the slight shift in deer tracks that signaled a change in their grazing patterns days before it became obvious to anyone still relying purely on calculation. He never stopped planning entirely, but he learned, finally, the difference between planning that served him and planning that simply added anxious weight to a knowing that had been available to him the entire time. By the following winter, his family ate well, not because his calculations had finally become perfect, but because he had learned, like the goose, to trust the moment when it actually arrived. In the Lakota tradition, there is a similar understanding carried through generations of careful attention to the natural world. Many Plains nations developed elaborate systems of observation, not rigid calendars imposed onto the land, but careful, patient attentiveness to the signs the land itself offered. The particular behavior of certain animals before a hard winter, the subtle shift in plant growth that signaled the right time for harvest or ceremony. This kind of knowing was never separate from action. It was a form of readiness, a deep familiarity with the land's own rhythm, cultivated over years of presence rather than years of calculation, that allowed a hunter or gatherer to move at exactly the right moment without needing to force that moment into being. There is a teaching, carried among several Plains nations, that wisdom is not the same as cleverness. Cleverness calculates. Wisdom waits, watches, and recognizes the moment that was already arriving, the same way the young hunter's grandfather recognized the geese's departure long before the birds themselves rose into the sky. The grandfather was teaching his grandson something Lakota elders have long understood. The deepest readiness does not come from controlling the future. It comes from being so fully present in the now that the right action becomes obvious when its moment finally arrives. This kind of attentiveness was not considered passive or secondary among many Plains nations. It was understood as a discipline in its own right, requiring as much dedication and practice as any other skill, perhaps more, because it asked a person to set aside the comfortable illusion of control in favor of a quieter, more demanding kind of presence. Think about something you have been over-planning, certain that more calculation would bring more certainty. You may have felt this yourself, the exhausting cycle of refining a plan again and again, only to find that the actual moment when it arrived asked for something the plan had never anticipated. This shows up in ordinary life in countless ways. The conversation rehearsed so many times in advance that it loses all its natural ease once it actually happens. The decision delayed by endless research when the right choice was already quietly clear from the very beginning. The day so tightly scheduled that there is no room left to notice what the day itself is actually offering. Not, but taken present enough to recognize the moment when it comes. You may notice, even now, the familiar pull toward planning tomorrow, organizing thoughts about what comes next. There is no need to follow that pull tonight. The geese do not plan their flight while resting. They simply rest fully until the moment arrives. Right now, in this breath, there is nothing to plan. Sleep does not arrive through scheduling. It arrives the way the geese take flight, quietly, all at once, the moment the body finally feels that the time has come. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a particular kind of leadership that looks, from the outside, like inaction. It is not. It is the discipline of withholding force until force is actually needed, rather than spending it constantly, anxiously, on every small disturbance that arises. Lao Tzu wrote that governing a large nation is like cooking a small fish. Too much poking, too much stirring, ruins what would otherwise have turned out well on its own. He was not describing carelessness, he was describing restraint as its own form of mastery. We tend to associate good leadership with visible effort, constant intervention, constant adjustment. Wu Wei asks us to consider that the steadiest hand is often the one that knows precisely when not to move. Tonight's third teaching is this: sometimes the wisest action is the action withheld until it is genuinely needed, and most disturbances, given enough patience, settle on their own. There was a young officer newly placed in command of a remote garrison at the edge of a contested border. He arrived eager to prove himself. Every minor dispute among the soldiers he addressed personally and immediately. Every rumor of unrest from the nearby villages he investigated himself, riding out at all hours, certain that decisive, visible action was the mark of a strong commander. Within weeks, he was utterly exhausted. The soldiers, rather than growing more disciplined under his constant attention, grew restless and resentful, sensing that his interventions reflected anxiety rather than genuine strength. The villages, visited so frequently and so urgently, began to suspect something was wrong, growing more nervous rather than more reassured. An old retired general who had once commanded that very garrison decades before and now lived quietly nearby was invited to dine with the young officer one evening. The young officer, eager for validation, recounted every decisive action he had taken that week. Disputes settled, rumors chased down, soldiers personally disciplined for the smallest infractions. The old general listened patiently, saying little, until the young officer finally paused for breath. "You have been very busy," the general said. "I have," the young officer agreed, taking this as praise. "A garrison this size requires constant vigilance." "Does it?" the general asked. "Or have you simply convinced yourself that constant motion is the same thing as actual command?" The young officer bristled slightly. "I do not understand the distinction." The general set down his cup and considered his words carefully. "When I commanded this garrison," he said, "I intervened in perhaps one dispute in 10. The other 9 resolved themselves, given a little time, far better than any intervention of mine could have managed. The soldiers learned to trust their own judgment. They learned to trust each other. A garrison that constantly needs its commander to settle every quarrel has not actually been led well. It has simply been managed anxiously." "But surely some disputes require intervention," the young officer said. "I cannot simply ignore everything." "Of course not," the general agreed. "The skill is not in ignoring everything. The skill is in recognizing which disputes will resolve themselves, given space, and which genuinely require your hand. Most fall into the first category far more often than a young commander believes." "How do I learn to tell the difference?" the young officer asked, his earlier defensiveness beginning to soften. "Watch before you act," the general said. Not forever, simply long enough to see whether the situation is actually escalating or whether it is merely loud in the moment and will settle on its own by morning. Most disputes between soldiers are loud in the moment. Few of them are actually dangerous. The young officer considered this, and something in his expression shifted, as though he were reconsidering not just his approach to command, but a much older habit of mind. "I think I've always believed that watching without acting was a kind of cowardice," he admitted. "That a true leader proves himself through visible response, not through patience." "Many young commanders believe this," the general said. "It is, in a sense, an understandable mistake. Visible action feels brave. Visible action is easy to point to, easy to be praised for. Watchful restraint offers nothing so satisfying to point to. And yet, in my long experience, restraint properly applied prevents far more harm than impulsive action ever resolves." The young officer thought of the dozens of disputes he had personally settled that week, remembering now how many of them had, in truth, been minor disagreements that likely would have resolved themselves without his intervention at all. "And the villages?" he asked. "Surely unrest near the border requires immediate investigation." "Genuine unrest, yes," the general said. "But consider this. Every time you ride out urgently to investigate a rumor, you confirm to the villagers that rumors are worth panicking over. You teach them, without meaning to, that the garrison is anxious, reactive, easily provoked into visible action. A commander who responds to every rumor with calm, measured patience, investigating quietly, only when truly warranted, teaches the villages something far more valuable, that the garrison is steady, that it does not need to prove its strength through constant motion." The young officer sat with this for a long while, the noise of his own exhausting week finally beginning to settle in his mind. "I have been mistaking anxiety for diligence," he said slowly. "Most young commanders do," the general said, not unkindly. "It takes time to learn that restraint, properly applied, is not the absence of strength. It is often the clearest evidence of it." The young officer changed his approach in the months that followed. He began watching more, intervening less, trusting his soldiers to settle their own minor disputes, investigating rumors with patience rather than urgency. The garrison, to his quiet astonishment, grew calmer rather than more chaotic. The villages, sensing a steadier hand even though they saw him less often, grew more at ease rather than more nervous. He never became a commander known for dramatic, visible action. He became instead a commander whose garrison simply ran well, quietly, steadily, with remarkably little need for him to intervene at all. In the Stoic tradition of ancient Greece and Rome, this same distinction between frantic activity and genuine command sits close to the center of the philosophy. Marcus Aurelius, writing as Roman emperor, often reminded himself in his private journal that most of what disturbs us is not the event itself, but our own anxious, exaggerated response to it. He counseled himself again and again to wait, to observe clearly before reacting, recognizing that the mind under pressure tends to magnify ordinary disturbances into apparent emergencies. Seneca wrote extensively about the difference between true strength and mere busyness, observing that those who appear constantly occupied are often the least in control of their own circumstances, mistaking motion for mastery. There is a Stoic teaching that equanimity itself is a form of strength, not passivity, but the disciplined refusal to be needlessly stirred by every small disturbance that arises. The young officer's exhaustion came not from too little effort, but from a fundamental confusion between visible effort and genuine command. The old general was teaching him something the Stoics understood deeply. The steadiest leaders are rarely the busiest ones. They are the ones who have learned through patient practice exactly when their intervention is needed and exactly when the wisest action is simply to wait, watch, and trust what will resolve on its own. Epictetus, who had himself once been a slave before becoming one of the most influential Stoic teachers, often emphasized that true freedom lay not in controlling external events, but in mastering one's own anxious, reactive impulses toward them. A discipline the young officer was only beginning to glimpse through his conversation with the old general. Think about a situation in your own life where you have been intervening constantly, certain that more action would bring more control. You may have felt this yourself, the exhausting cycle of responding to every small disturbance immediately, only to find that your constant intervention left you more tired and the underlying situation no calmer than before. This shows up in ordinary life in familiar ways. The urge to respond instantly to every message, every minor conflict, every small uncertainty, as though delay itself were a kind of failure. The parent who intervenes in every small disagreement between children, never giving them the chance to learn their own resolution. The manager who cannot resist correcting every small decision, never trusting the team to find its own steady footing. But this evening, notice if there is any part of you still standing watch, still anxiously monitoring something that does not actually require your attention right now. You are permitted tonight to stand down from that post. Right now, in this breath, there is nothing that requires your intervention. Whatever has been loud today will likely be quieter by morning. You do not need to manage this moment. You only need to rest in it, trusting that what truly needs your attention will still be there tomorrow, clearer, once you have rested. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a difference between working towards something and working because of love for the work itself. The first kind of working is always reaching past the present moment toward a result that has not yet arrived. The second kind is fully here, fully present, regardless of what comes after. Lao Tzu wrote that the sage acts but does not possess, accomplishes but does not dwell on the accomplishment. This is not indifference to outcomes. It is a particular freedom, doing the work fully, without the exhausting weight of constantly grasping at what the work might bring. Wu Wei, in this light, is not about avoiding effort. It is about effort that flows freely, unburdened by anxious attachment to a specific result. Tonight's fourth teaching is this: the work done with an open hand often turns out finer than the work done with a clenched, anxious fist. There was a weaver renowned throughout her village for cloth so fine that merchants travelled great distances simply to purchase a single bolt. In her younger years, she had worked with a constant, gnawing anxiety. Every thread had to be perfect. Every pattern had to surpass her last. She measured her worth entirely by the cloth she produced, and so every flaw, however small, felt like a wound to something deeper than the fabric itself. She grew older, and though her skill remained extraordinary, the joy had slowly drained from her work, replaced by a kind of exhausted vigilance that left her sleepless many nights, replaying flaws only she could see. One autumn, a wandering teacher passed through the village and was invited to stay in her home, as was the custom for travellers of evident wisdom. The teacher watched her work for several days, saying little, simply observing the particular tension in her shoulders as she wove, the way her eyes darted anxiously over each completed row, searching for imperfection. On the fourth evening, the teacher finally spoke. "You weave beautifully," the teacher said, "and you weave as though something terrible will happen if you stop watching it so closely." The weaver paused, her hands still on the loom. "If I do not watch closely, the pattern will be flawed." "Will it?" the teacher asked. "Or will it simply be itself, flawed or not, the way every pattern in the world already is, if you look closely enough?" The weaver frowned, uncertain what the teacher meant. "Tell me," the teacher said, "what happens in your mind when you finish a piece?" The weaver considered this honestly. "I look immediately for what is wrong with it. I rarely allow myself to simply see what is right. And when a piece is praised by others, I feel a brief relief," she admitted, "and then immediately I begin worrying whether the next piece will measure up." The teacher nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something already suspected. "You have built your entire craft around a destination that never arrives. Each finished piece is not actually a completion for you. It is simply a brief pause before the next anxious beginning." The weaver set down her shuttle, something in her chest tightening at the accuracy of this observation. "How else am I supposed to work?" she asked. "Surely caring about the outcome is what makes the work good in the first place." "Caring and grasping are not the same thing," the teacher said. "A farmer who plants a seed cares deeply whether it grows, but a wise farmer does not dig up the seed every morning to check on its progress, disturbing the very roots that need stillness to take hold. The caring is real. The constant anxious checking only damages what the caring was meant to protect." The weaver was quiet for a long moment, the comparison settling slowly into something she could actually feel rather than merely understand intellectually. "I think I have been digging up my own seeds my whole life," she said. "Every piece I have ever made I have unearthed before it was finished, in my mind at least, worrying it into existence rather than trusting it to grow on its own." "This is very common among the most talented," the teacher said. "Talent often arrives alongside a particular fear. The fear that without constant vigilance the talent itself might somehow disappear. But talent, once developed, does not require this anxious supervision to remain present. It requires instead the trust to let it simply do what it already knows how to do. The weaver looked at her loom, half finished, the pattern she had been agonizing over for 3 days already visible in its early threads. "What would it look like?" the teacher asked. "To weave this piece simply because you love weaving, not because you are anxious about how it will be judged once it is finished." "I am not certain I remember how to do that," the weaver admitted quietly. "It has been so long since I wove simply for the love of it." "Then begin tomorrow," the teacher said, "not by trying to feel differently, simply by noticing each time the old anxiety arises that it has arrived again, without fighting it, without judging yourself for it. Notice it. Let it pass through you. Return your attention to the thread in your hands exactly as it is, right now." The weaver tried this the following morning, though it felt strange and uncertain at first, like speaking a language she had once known but long forgotten. Each time her mind reached anxiously toward the finished piece, toward how it might be judged, she gently noticed the reaching, and returned her attention to the single thread passing through her fingers in that exact moment. It did not happen all at once, but over the following weeks, something in her work began to shift. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly, then more. She began noticing details in her craft she had been too anxious to see before. The particular way the morning light caught a certain dye, the satisfying rhythm of the shuttle moving back and forth, the simple pleasure of watching a pattern emerge thread by thread, rather than anxiously willing it toward some imagined final form. Her work did not become careless. If anything, it deepened, carrying a quality her earlier anxious pieces had never quite achieved, a kind of ease that customers, without being able to name it precisely, found themselves drawn to again and again. She wove for many more years after the teacher continued on his travels. She still cared deeply about her craft. But she had finally learned the difference between caring for the work and grasping anxiously at what the work might bring her. The cloth, freed from that grasping, seemed somehow to breathe more easily on the loom, and so, at long last, did she. In Hindu philosophical tradition, this exact teaching sits at the heart of one of its most enduring texts. The Bhagavad Gita presents a teaching known as Nishkama Karma, action performed without attachment to its results. The god Krishna instructs the warrior Arjuna that he has the right to perform his actions, but never to the fruits of those actions. The doing matters. The anxious grasping at outcome does not need to accompany it. This is often misunderstood as encouraging indifference, as though caring about results were itself the problem. The deeper teaching suggests something more precise: full, wholehearted engagement with the action itself, paired with a release of the anxious need to control what comes after. A teacher within this tradition might say that the weaver's early anxiety was not evidence of how much she cared. It was evidence of how tightly she had confused caring with controlling, a confusion Nishkama Karma directly addresses, teaching that the finest work often emerges precisely when the anxious grasping finally loosens. There is a related teaching about karma yoga, the path of selfless action, which holds that work done in this spirit becomes, paradoxically, both more skillful and more peaceful than work driven by anxious attachment to outcome. The weaver discovered this not through philosophy, but through the patient daily practice of simply returning to the thread in her hands. This same teaching distinguishes between two kinds of doer, sometimes described in Hindu philosophical commentary: one who acts from a settled, unattached center, and one who acts from restless craving, perpetually grasping after a result that, even when achieved, never quite satisfies. The weaver in her earlier years was unmistakably the second kind. Her transformation was not a change in skill, but a change in this deeper orientation toward her own work. Think about something you do that has become weighed down by anxious attachment to how it will turn out. You may have felt this yourself. Work that once brought genuine pleasure, now approached with a kind of grim vigilance, every step shadowed by worry about the final result, rather than enjoyed for what it actually is in the moment. This shows up in ordinary life in familiar ways. The meal cooked with more anxiety than joy, eyes darting toward the clock rather than the simple pleasure of chopping, stirring, tasting. The conversation approached so anxiously that you miss what the other person is actually saying, too busy rehearsing how it will be received. The quiet hobby that once relaxed you, now another arena for anxious self-judgment. Not. But if your mind reaches tonight toward tomorrow's tasks, toward how well you will perform them, gently notice the reaching, the way the weaver learned to notice her own anxious checking, and return simply to this breath. Right now, in this breath, there is no outcome to grasp at. Sleep is not a destination you must anxiously will yourself toward. It is simply what happens when the grasping finally gently lets go. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a kind of hunger that has nothing to do with food. It is the hunger for more achievement, more certainty, more proof that we have done enough to finally rest. This hunger rarely responds to being fed. It simply grows larger with each thing gained, asking immediately for the next. The Buddha taught that this endless reaching, tanha in the old language, is the root of much human suffering. Not desire itself, which is natural and even useful, but the particular grasping quality of desire that refuses to ever feel satisfied. Lao Tzu pointed toward something similar when he wrote that knowing when enough is itself a kind of wealth, perhaps the only kind that does not eventually exhaust the person holding it. This is a difficult teaching to hold in a world that constantly suggests, through every advertisement and every comparison, that more is always the answer worth pursuing. Tonight's fifth teaching is this: some of the deepest peace available to us has nothing to do with getting more. It has to do with finally noticing what is already, quietly, enough. There was a wealthy merchant who had spent his entire life acquiring things. Houses, lands, fine silks, rare porcelain. His collection grew every year, and yet his satisfaction never seemed to grow alongside it. Each new acquisition brought a brief flush of pleasure, quickly followed by a familiar emptiness, and the conviction that the next purchase would finally be the one that filled it completely. He heard one year of a monk living simply in the hills above his city, said to possess a single wooden bowl and nothing else of material value, and yet reputed to be the most contented man in the entire province. The merchant, intrigued and somewhat skeptical, travelled up into the hills to see for himself. He found the monk sitting outside a small bare hut, eating rice from his single wooden bowl, an expression of such evident peace on his face that the merchant felt immediately and uncomfortably a pang of envy. "How can you be content?" the merchant asked, "with so little? I have houses, lands, more silk than I could wear in 10 lifetimes, and still I wake each morning wanting more. You have one bowl, and you seem to want for nothing at all." The monk gestured for the merchant to sit and offered him a small portion of rice from his own simple meal. "Tell me," the monk said, "how many houses do you actually need?" "One, I suppose," the merchant admitted, "but I own 4. "And how many silk robes can you wear at once?" "One," the merchant said, beginning to see where this was leading, though resisting it slightly. "But I own perhaps 200. "And this bowl," the monk said, holding it up gently, "how many do I need?" "1," the merchant said. "I have one," the monk said simply. The merchant sat with this for a long moment, the simplicity of it both obvious and somehow elusive. "But surely," he said, "there is virtue in providing well for one's family, in building something substantial." "There is," the monk agreed. "I am not suggesting you give away your houses. I am asking a different question. Does the 5th house bring you anything the first house did not already provide? Does the 200th robe warm you any more than the first?" The merchant considered this honestly. "No," he admitted slowly. "If anything, each new acquisition seems to bring less satisfaction than the one before it, though I keep expecting the opposite." "This is the nature of grasping," the monk said. "It promises that the next thing will finally be enough. It never delivers on that promise because the hunger was never actually about the thing itself. It was about an emptiness that no amount of acquisition can fill because acquisition was never the right remedy for it in the first place." "Then what is the remedy?" the merchant asked, genuine curiosity now overtaking his earlier skepticism. The monk considered the question for a long moment before responding, as though weighing how much truth the merchant was actually ready to receive. "The remedy," he said finally, "is not acquiring less exactly, though that may follow naturally. The remedy is noticing, each time the hunger arises, that it is asking the wrong question. It asks, will this next thing finally be enough? But the question itself assumes that enough is something to be reached through accumulation, rather than something already available right now in whatever you already hold. Once you see this clearly, even once, the hunger loosens its grip slightly. Not all at once, but slightly each time you notice it." The monk held up his single bowl again. "This bowl is not empty, waiting to be filled by more bowls. It is already complete exactly as it is, doing exactly what a bowl is meant to do. I eat from it, I am nourished. I do not lie awake wondering whether a second bowl would nourish me more thoroughly. But you have chosen poverty, the merchant said. I have built something. Surely that distinction matters. It is not poverty, the monk said gently. Poverty is lacking what you need. I lack nothing I need. You, with 4 houses and 200 robes, may understand poverty far better than I do, if what you are describing is a hunger that no amount of acquisition has ever satisfied. The merchant returned to his city troubled, though not unhappily so. He did not immediately give away his houses or his silks, but he found himself in the weeks that followed noticing the particular feeling that arose each time he considered a new purchase, the brief anticipation, the familiar emptiness that followed regardless of what he bought. He began slowly to ask the monk's question of himself before each acquisition. Does this bring me anything the things I already have do not provide? More often than not, the honest answer was no. He never became a monk himself. He kept his houses, his lands, his considerable wealth, but something in his relationship with all of it shifted. He stopped reaching so anxiously for the next thing and began, for what felt like the first time in decades, to actually notice what he already held. Years later, visiting the monk again, now both considerably older, the merchant brought no gifts, expected no lesson. He simply sat beside the old man, ate a simple meal from a single bowl, and found, to his quiet astonishment, that he wanted for nothing at all in that particular moment, a feeling his vast collection of possessions had never once managed to provide. This teaching of sufficiency runs through the very heart of Buddhist understanding, recorded across centuries of teaching following the Buddha's own insights. The second of the Buddha's 4 noble truths identifies tanha, often translated as craving or thirst, as the root of suffering. Not desire itself, which arises naturally in any living being, but the particular grasping quality that refuses ever to feel satisfied, always reaching toward the next acquisition, the next achievement, the next proof of enough. The Buddhist concept of santosha, contentment, is not passivity or resignation. It is an active practice of recognizing sufficiency in the present moment rather than perpetually deferring peace to some future point when enough has finally, supposedly, been acquired. There is a teaching often shared in Buddhist communities about a king who possessed everything imaginable and yet remained miserable, until a wise adviser gave him a single ring inscribed with the words, "This too shall pass." A reminder that satisfaction built on accumulation will always eventually feel insufficient, because accumulation was never actually capable of answering the question being asked of it. The monk's single bowl in our story embodies this teaching directly, not deprivation, but a precise understanding of sufficiency, the recognition that peace was never going to arrive through one more acquisition, because it was never actually located in acquisition to begin with. Buddhist teachers across many lineages have emphasized that this understanding of sufficiency is not meant to produce guilt about desire itself, which arises naturally and is not, in itself, a failing. The practice is simply noticing, again and again, the particular quality of restless grasping when it arises, and gently returning attention to what is already completely present. Think about something you have been reaching for, certain that having it would finally bring lasting satisfaction. You may have felt this yourself, the particular pattern of anticipation followed by brief pleasure, followed by a returning emptiness, regardless of how significant the achievement or acquisition actually was. This shows up in ordinary life in familiar ways. The promotion that brought relief for exactly 1 week before the mind moved on to the next target. The purchase that felt essential in the store and unremarkable within days of bringing it home. The achievement celebrated briefly before the question immediately arose, what comes next? But there is nothing tonight that you are lacking. Whatever tomorrow may ask of you, right now, in this single ordinary moment, you already hold everything required. Right now, in this breath, you do not need anything more than what you already have. This bed, this breath, this particular ordinary moment. It is, in its own way, already complete, not because nothing else matters, but because right now, nothing else is actually required. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a particular wisdom in waiting for a door to actually be ready to open. A key forced into the wrong lock, or the right lock at the wrong moment, accomplishes nothing but damage to the lock and often to the key itself. The skill is not only in cutting the key correctly, it is in knowing when to use it at all. Lao Tzu wrote that those who know when to stop avoid danger, and that timing itself is a form of wisdom equal to any technical skill. Wu Wei asks us to consider that some of our greatest frustrations come not from lacking the right tool, but from trying to use the right tool before its moment has actually arrived. Tonight's sixth teaching is this. Readiness is not only about being prepared, it is about recognizing when the moment itself is finally, genuinely ready to receive what you are offering. There was a locksmith renowned throughout the city for crafting keys so precise they never failed. A young apprentice, eager and talented, struggled with one particular skill his master seemed to possess effortlessly, knowing not just how to cut a key, but when to actually use it. The apprentice had once been given a commission to open a stubborn old chest, its lock rusted nearly solid with age, belonging to a wealthy widow who had lost the original key decades before. The apprentice worked for hours, cutting key after key, each one slightly more refined than the last, growing increasingly frustrated as each attempt failed to turn the ancient, corroded mechanism. Finally, in frustration, he forced the latest key with considerable strength. It snapped cleanly in half inside the lock, jamming the mechanism completely and rendering the chest, for the time being, entirely unopenable. He brought the broken key and his frustration to his master that evening. The old locksmith examined the broken key carefully, then asked to see the lock itself. "This mechanism is not simply rusted," the master said after a long, careful inspection. "It is swollen with damp. No key, however perfectly cut, will turn it as it currently is." "Then what was I supposed to do?" the apprentice asked, his frustration still evident. "Nothing for now," the master said. The lock was not ready for a key. It needed something else first. What else could it possibly need? Time and dry air, the master said. Bring the chest inside near the fire and leave it undisturbed for several days. The wood and metal will slowly release the damp they have absorbed. Only then will the mechanism be ready to accept a key at all. The apprentice did as instructed, though it felt strange and unproductive to simply leave the chest sitting near the fire, doing nothing visible toward solving the actual problem. 5 days later, the master examined the lock again, testing its give with a thin metal probe. Now, he said, we can consider a key. The new key the master cut turned smoothly on the very first attempt, the old mechanism yielding easily to a tool no more precisely made than several of the apprentice's earlier failed attempts. The key was not better than mine, the apprentice said, somewhat amazed. The lock was simply finally ready. Yes, the master said. You assumed the problem was your skill with the key. The actual problem was timing. You were trying to force a solution onto a situation that was not yet capable of receiving it. The apprentice thought about this for a long while in the days that followed. How do I know in the future when something is ready and when it merely appears stubborn? He asked his master some weeks later, working on an entirely different commission. You learn to listen rather than only to push, the master said. When a key resists, ask first whether the lock itself needs attention before assuming the key needs adjustment. Sometimes the most skillful thing you can do is set the key down and wait. That feels like doing nothing, the apprentice admitted. It feels like failing to solve the problem. It often looks that way, the master agreed, especially to an apprentice eager to prove his skill through visible effort. But I assure you, the widow whose chest you nearly ruined would have preferred 5 days of apparent inactivity to a forced key snapped off inside her grandmother's lock. The apprentice considered this, turning the broken key over once more in his hands, feeling its sharp edges where it had snapped under his own frustrated force. How do I explain this to a customer, he asked, when they are anxious for results, and I must tell them the honest answer is simply to wait? You explain it the way I have just explained it to you, the master said. Most people, when they understand that patience serves the outcome they actually want, will accept the wait far more readily than they accept a broken lock and a damaged chest. The difficulty is rarely in convincing the customer. The difficulty is in convincing yourself, the craftsman, that waiting is not a failure of your skill, but an expression of it. The apprentice carried this lesson forward into his own long career as a locksmith. He became known, eventually, not only for his technical skill, but for a particular patience that set him apart from other craftsmen, a willingness to recognize when a lock, a situation, a person simply was not yet ready, and to wait without anxiety until it was. Decades later, training his own apprentice, he found himself repeating almost exactly what his master had once told him, standing beside a different stubborn lock, a different swollen mechanism, the lesson passing forward exactly as patiently as it had once been given to him. In the Hasidic tradition of Eastern European Judaism, there is a teaching that speaks directly to this same wisdom about timing. Hasidic masters often taught that every soul, Every moment, every encounter carries its own readiness, its own season, and that forcing spiritual growth before its proper time can damage rather than nurture what is trying to unfold. There is a concept sometimes described as the right moment for teaching, a recognition that the same words, offered too early or too late, may fail to land, while offered at precisely the right moment, transform completely. The Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, was known for waiting patiently, sometimes for years, before offering a particular teaching to a particular student, trusting that the student's own readiness, not the teacher's eagerness, determined when the teaching would actually take root. There is a Hasidic story about a rabbi who delayed answering a difficult question for an entire year, not from forgetfulness or evasion, but because he sensed the questioner was not yet ready to truly hear the answer. When he finally responded, exactly 1 year later, the student wept. Not because the answer was different from what might have been given earlier, but because he was, at last, finally ready to receive it. The old locksmith, waiting patiently for the swollen lock to dry, was practicing something close to this same wisdom. Sometimes the most skillful action available to us is simply recognizing that the moment has not yet arrived and trusting that patience, rather than force, is what the situation actually requires. This teaching extends, in Hasidic tradition, beyond individual moments of patience into a broader understanding of spiritual development itself. The belief that growth cannot be rushed through sheer willpower alone, but unfolds according to a timing that often exceeds what the anxious, striving mind would prefer. Think about something you have been forcing, certain that more effort would finally make it work. You may have felt this yourself, pushing toward a conversation, a decision, a change, before the situation or the person or even you yourself were actually ready to receive it. This shows up in ordinary life in familiar ways. The difficult conversation forced before either person has had time to cool down. The business idea pushed forward before the market, or your own skills were genuinely ready to support it. The apology offered too soon, before the other person has had space to actually feel heard. Not, but. If there is something tonight you have been trying to force open before its time, let it rest, undisturbed until morning. The lock will still be there, so will you, steadier for having waited. Right now, in this breath, there is nothing that needs forcing. Sleep, too, has its own readiness, its own moment that cannot be rushed by sheer determination. You do not need to force this. You only need to wait, gently, trusting that the moment will arrive exactly when it is ready to. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a strange kind of mastery that does not look like mastery at all. It does not announce itself. It does not strain. To an untrained eye, it can even look like indifference, when in truth it is the deepest, most complete attention a person can offer. Lao Tzu wrote that the expert traveler leaves no trace, the expert speaker makes no errors, the expert in anything does what is needed so naturally that the effort itself becomes invisible. This is where at its most refined, not the absence of skill, but skill so thoroughly absorbed that it no longer needs to perform itself. Tonight's seventh teaching is this: the deepest mastery often looks from the outside like ease, and it usually is. There was a young archer who had trained for years to win the great tournament held each autumn in the capital. He was extraordinarily skilled by any conventional measure. His form was flawless. His draw was strong and steady, and yet, year after year, in the actual moment of competition, something in him tightened, and his arrows, while still respectable, never quite achieved the perfection his private practice suggested he was capable of. He sought out an old archery master who lived in seclusion outside the city, said to have once been the finest archer in the realm before retiring abruptly at the height of his fame. The old master agreed to observe him. The young archer drew his bow with evident skill, released and struck near the center of the target, an excellent shot by any standard, though not the perfect strike he had been hoping the master would witness. Again, the master said. The young archer shot a dozen more arrows, each one skilled, each one slightly short of the perfection he was straining toward. "You are trying very hard," the master observed. "Of course," the young archer said. "The tournament is in 3 weeks. I must be perfect." "Show me your private practice," the master said. "Not for me, simply as you would shoot alone with no one watching, no tournament looming." The young archer hesitated, then drew and released several more arrows, this time with less visible strain, his attention settling into something quieter, more familiar. These arrows struck closer to the center, several of them landing in the small ring that marked true mastery. "Interesting," the master said. "Your arrows fly truer when you are not trying so hard to make them perfect." The young archer lowered his bow, frustrated. "I do not understand. I am trying harder during the tournament, not less. Surely greater effort should produce greater accuracy." The old master gestured for him to sit, and they rested together at the edge of the practice field. "Let me tell you about the day I retired," the master said. "I had just won my final tournament, the greatest victory of my career. And in that moment of triumph, I realized something that troubled me deeply. I could not remember releasing the final arrow. My body had done it. My mind had been entirely absent, simply watching, not directing." "That sounds like a failure of focus," the young archer said. "It was the opposite," the master said. "It was the deepest focus I had ever achieved, so complete that there was no longer a separate me standing apart from the bow, the arrow, the target, directing the shot from some anxious distance. The shooting simply happened, the way breathing happens, the way a river finds the sea." "Then why did you retire, if you had achieved such mastery?" "Because I realized that this state, what we sometimes call no mind, cannot be summoned by trying harder. The trying itself is what keeps it away." I had spent years training my body to achieve technical perfection, But the final piece, the piece that actually produced my greatest shot, arrived only once I stopped consciously trying to produce it at all. The young archer considered his own recent shots, the strained, effortful ones during the simulated tournament conditions, the easier, truer ones during private, low-stakes practice. "You are telling me that my trying is the problem," he said slowly. "Your trying is not wrong," the master said. "It built your skill. Without years of disciplined practice, you would have nothing for your body to draw on in the moment that matters. But once the skill is built, a different kind of practice is needed. The practice of trusting what your body already knows, rather than anxiously supervising it." "How do I practice that?" the young archer asked. "It feels like asking me to practice not practicing." The master smiled, the first time he had done so during their entire exchange. "In a sense, yes. Begin by noticing, each time you draw your bow in competition, the exact moment your mind tightens with anxious effort. Do not fight it. Simply notice it, the way you might notice a cloud passing. Then return your attention to the simplest thing available, your breath, the weight of the bow, the target itself, without commentary. And if the anxiety returns again and again, even after I notice it," the young archer asked. "It will," the master said, with the particular calm of someone who has long since stopped being troubled by this fact. "The anxiety is not your enemy, and it is not something to be conquered once and never seen again. It will return many times throughout your career, throughout your life. The practice is not eliminating it. The practice is noticing it more quickly each time and returning more easily each time to the simple, quiet attention beneath it." The young archer trained differently in the weeks that followed, less focused on technical perfection and more focused on this quieter, less anxious form of attention. It felt at first like doing less, like risking failure by trying less hard. At the autumn tournament, standing before the assembled crowd, he felt the familiar tightening begin in his chest. This time, rather than fighting it or being swept along by it, he simply noticed it, let it pass through him like the old master had described, and drew his bow with an attention that was full and quiet rather than strained and anxious. His arrow struck dead center. He did not win every match that followed through pure technical superiority alone, but something had shifted permanently in how he approached not just archery, but every difficult moment that followed in his life. A recognition that the deepest skill often required, paradoxically, the courage to stop gripping it so tightly. In the Japanese Zen tradition, this exact teaching has shaped centuries of practice across many disciplines, from archery to calligraphy to swordsmanship. The concept of mushin, often translated as no mind, describes precisely the state the old master once experienced in his final tournament. A quality of attention so complete that the anxious, separate observer falls away and action flows directly from trained skill without the interference of conscious, effortful supervision. The classical text on Zen archery, widely studied across generations of practitioners, describes the moment of true mastery not as the archer hitting the target, but as the disappearance of any meaningful distinction between archer, bow, arrow, and target. a unified, effortless action arising from years of disciplined practice, finally allowed to express itself without obstruction. Zen teachers often caution students against mistaking this teaching for an excuse to avoid discipline. The effortlessness described in Mushin is earned, not given freely. It arrives only after the kind of rigorous, patient training the young archer had already completed. The difference is simply learning, finally, to trust that training rather than anxiously second-guessing it in the decisive moment. This is precisely what the old master was teaching his young visitor. Mastery is not the absence of skill. It is skill so thoroughly absorbed into the body that the mind finally can step back and simply allow it to happen. This understanding extends well beyond archery into virtually every discipline shaped by Zen influence, from tea ceremony to calligraphy to the martial arts, each one built on the same foundational insight, that years of disciplined practice eventually produce a kind of knowing the conscious mind cannot improve upon through additional effortful supervision. Think about something you do well, but only when you are not anxiously trying too hard to do it perfectly. You may have felt this yourself, a skill, a conversation, a familiar task that flows easily when your attention is simple and present, and grows strained, awkward, less skillful the moment you begin anxiously supervising your own performance. This shows up in ordinary life in familiar ways, the conversation that flows naturally until you begin worrying about how you sound, the familiar task done 1,000 times that suddenly becomes clumsy the moment someone is watching and you begin consciously directing every movement. The decision that becomes clear the moment you stop anxiously turning it over and simply trust what you already know. But your body already knows how to rest. It has done this every single night of your life. Tonight, let it simply do what it already fully knows how to do. Right now, in this breath, you do not need to try hard to rest. Trying hard at rest only produces the same tightening the young archer once felt drawing his bow. Simply notice this moment exactly as it is, and let whatever happens next happen on its own. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a difference between digging for water and finding the place where water is already waiting to rise. One requires endless, exhausting labor against stone and earth that may never yield. The other requires patience, observation, and the wisdom to recognize a place that was always going to give freely, if only someone paused long enough to notice it. Lao Tzu wrote that the great rivers and seas are kings of the 100 valleys because they know how to stay low, how to receive rather than seize. Wu Wei suggests that some of our most exhausting struggles come from digging where nothing is hidden, while the actual source waits quietly nearby, simply asking to be noticed. Tonight's 8th teaching is this: not everything worth having must be wrestled into existence. Some things are already rising toward you, waiting only for you to stop digging long enough to receive them. There was a village that had suffered through 3 dry summers, its old well having finally run dry, its people growing increasingly desperate. A young man, eager to prove himself useful to his struggling community, took it upon himself to dig a new well. He chose a spot near the village centre, convenient and visible, and began digging with tremendous determination, certain that enough effort would eventually strike water. He dug for weeks. His hands blistered, then calloused. The hole grew deep, and still no water came. The villagers, watching his exhausting labour, grew alternately hopeful and despairing with each passing day. An old woman who lived at the edge of the village, known for keeping mostly to herself, watched his digging with quiet attention for many days before finally approaching him. "You have chosen a difficult spot," she said. "I have chosen the most convenient spot," the young man replied, not pausing in his work, "close to every house, easy for everyone to reach." "Convenience and water are not always found in the same place," the old woman said. The young man, frustrated and exhausted, set down his shovel. "Do you know where water actually is, then? If so, why have you not said so before now?" "I did not think you wanted to hear it," she said simply. "You seemed determined to find it through effort alone." "Tell me," the young man said, his pride finally yielding to genuine need. The old woman led him to the edge of the forest, perhaps half a mile from the village, to a small hollow surrounded by unusually vivid green moss, even in the midst of the dry summer. "Notice this place," she said. "The moss here has stayed green through 3 dry summers, while everything around it has browned and withered." "What does that mean?" the young man asked. "It means water is close to the surface here, even now," she said. "Closer than anywhere near the village, where you have been digging into solid, dry stone for weeks with nothing to show for it." "How do you know this?" the young man asked, genuinely curious now. "My grandmother taught me to notice it," the old woman said. "The way certain plants thrive where others struggle. The way the air feels slightly different, slightly cooler near a hidden spring. These are not secrets requiring magic to perceive. They simply require attention, patient enough to notice what is already being shown. Why did no one tell me this before I began digging?" "Many of us assumed you knew," she admitted. "Or that you would ask eventually rather than committing so quickly to the most visible, most convenient location." The young man felt a flash of something close to embarrassment, recognizing how readily he had assumed his own first instinct must be correct, simply because it was the most obvious, most convenient option available. "I think I chose that spot," he admitted slowly, "not because I had any real reason to believe water was there, but because it was the spot everyone would see me digging. I wanted to be seen working hard." The old woman did not respond immediately, allowing the admission to settle on its own. "That is a common enough reason," she said eventually. "Many people choose the visible struggle over the quiet attentiveness, because struggle is more easily recognized by others as effort. Attentiveness often looks from the outside like doing nothing at all, even when it is actually the harder, more valuable skill." The young man looked back toward his half-dug well near the village centre, weeks of exhausting labour represented in that deep, dry hole, and then toward the small, vividly green hollow at the forest's edge. "It is farther from the village," he said. "Less convenient." "Yes," the old woman agreed. "But it has water. The other has only your considerable effort, which, however admirable, cannot manufacture water where none exists to be found." The young man began digging at the new location the following morning, somewhat humbled, his earlier confidence tempered now with a new attentiveness. He dug only a fraction of the depth his first attempt had required before water began seeping into the hole, slowly at first, then more steadily. Within days, the new well was producing clean, steady water, more than enough for the entire village. The young man, walking past his original abandoned hole some weeks later, found himself reflecting on the difference between the two efforts. The first had demanded enormous labour for nothing. The second had required instead patience and careful attention, noticing what the land itself was already quietly showing him. He became in later years something of an informal guide for the village in matters of this kind, not because he possessed special magical knowledge, but because he had learned through this single humbling experience to look more carefully before committing his effort, to ask whether a place was actually offering what he sought before exhausting himself trying to force it to yield something it never held to begin with. He told the story often, particularly to young people eager to prove themselves through visible struggle, the same way he himself had once been. "Effort matters," he would tell them. "But effort aimed in the wrong direction is not virtue. It is simply exhaustion dressed up as diligence. Look first, notice what is already being offered, then dig." In the Celtic wisdom tradition of the British Isles and Ireland, there is a deep and ancient reverence for sacred wells and springs, places understood not as locations to be conquered through human effort, but as gifts already present, waiting to be respectfully received. Many holy wells throughout Celtic lands were never dug by human hands at all. They were discovered, recognized by careful observers attentive to the particular signs the land itself offered. Unusually vivid vegetation, a persistent dampness in otherwise dry soil, a quality of stillness in the air that careful, patient people learned to notice. There is a concept in Celtic spirituality sometimes described through the image of thin places, locations where the boundary between the ordinary world and something deeper grows permeable, not through any effort to force that permeability into being, but through a quality of attentive presence that allows what was already there to finally be noticed. Pilgrims traveling to these sacred wells understood something the young digger in our story had to learn through exhausting trial. The deepest gifts are rarely manufactured through force. They are received by those patient and attentive enough to recognize where they are already, quietly, waiting. The old woman's wisdom about the green moss reflects this same Celtic understanding, that the land continually offers signs to those willing to slow down enough to actually see them, rather than rushing immediately toward the most visible, most convenient point of exhausting labor. This tradition of careful attentiveness extended throughout much of Celtic agricultural and spiritual practice. shaping a relationship with the land that valued patient observation as highly as physical labor itself, understanding that the two, properly joined, produced far better results than labor pursued without genuine attention to what the land was already quietly communicating. Think about something you have been struggling to manufacture through sheer effort in a place that may simply not hold what you are looking for. You may have felt this yourself, exhausting yourself in pursuit of an outcome in exactly the location convention suggested, while signs pointing elsewhere went unnoticed, simply because you were too committed to your original effort to pause and look around. This shows up in ordinary life in familiar ways. The career path pursued doggedly because it seemed the obvious choice, while genuine enthusiasm kept quietly pointing somewhere else entirely. The relationship forced toward a particular shape because it seemed convenient or expected, while real compatibility was being patiently offered in an entirely different direction. The solution to a problem sought through ever more strenuous effort when a gentler, more observant approach might have revealed it already close at hand. But perhaps tonight, instead of searching for rest through effort, you might simply notice where it is already quietly present, in this breath, in this stillness, in the simple fact of having arrived here. Right now, in this breath, there is nothing to dig for. Rest is not buried deep beneath layers of effort you must exhaust yourself reaching. It is closer than that, already rising, quietly, the moment you stop digging long enough to notice it. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a kind of leadership that mistakes its own certainty for the only available wisdom. It pushes forward, alone, convinced that decisive solo action is the mark of true strength. And it often misses, in its hurry, the wisdom that was quietly available all along in the voices it never paused to hear. Lao Tzu wrote that the sage has no fixed mind of his own, but takes the mind of the people as his own mind. This is not weakness or indecision. It is a different understanding of strength, one that draws on collective wisdom rather than insisting that strength must always look like a single will, forcing its way forward alone. This teaching can feel counterintuitive in moments of pressure, when decisive solo action seems like the only proof of genuine capability. And yet the deepest, most lasting decisions are rarely the ones reached in isolation. Tonight's 9th teaching is this: some of the wisest action available to a leader, or to any of us, is simply the willingness to listen fully before acting at all. There was a young chief who inherited leadership of his village during a time of significant uncertainty, as a long drought threatened the community's harvest and tensions simmered over how best to respond. He had been raised to believe that a strong leader makes swift, decisive choices, and so he moved quickly, announcing a plan to relocate the entire village to land near a distant river, certain this bold action would demonstrate his capability and resolve. The plan, however, was poorly received. Elders raised concerns he had not considered. Ancestral burial grounds that would be left behind, complicated grazing rights with neighboring villages near the proposed new location, the considerable danger of moving vulnerable elderly members and young children during the very drought that had prompted the move in the first place. The young chief, certain of his own judgment, pressed forward anyway, frustrated that his decisive leadership was being questioned rather than celebrated. His grandmother, a respected elder who had advised 3 chiefs before him, finally requested a private conversation. "You have decided alone," she said without preamble. "A chief must be decisive," the young man replied. "Constant deliberation looks like weakness." "Does it?" she asked. "Or does it look like wisdom when the deliberation actually produces a stronger decision than any single person could have reached alone?" The young chief considered this, his earlier certainty wavering slightly. "But if I gather everyone's opinions, will I not simply become paralyzed by competing voices, unable to act at all?" "There is a difference," his grandmother said, "between gathering voices to avoid deciding and gathering voices because you understand that no single person, however capable, holds the entire picture alone. You have not considered the burial grounds. You have not considered the grazing disputes. These were not failures of your intelligence. They were simply outside what one person, however wise, can see from a single vantage point. Then how do I lead if I cannot trust my own judgment to be sufficient?" "You can trust your judgment," she said, "and you can also trust that your judgment, joined with the judgment of those who see what you cannot, becomes something stronger than either alone. This is not a contradiction. It is simply how wisdom actually accumulates in any community worth leading." "I think I have been afraid," the young chief admitted, "that gathering many voices would somehow reveal that I was not capable enough to lead alone. That a truly strong chief would not need anyone else's perspective." His grandmother regarded him with something close to tenderness. "Every chief I have known has carried that same fear, at least at the beginning. It is a young fear, born of believing that strength must look a particular way to be recognized as strength. The chiefs who lasted longest, who were remembered most fondly, were rarely the ones who insisted on deciding everything alone. They were the ones who learned, often through difficult lessons like the one you are facing now, that gathering wisdom is itself a form of strength, not a confession of weakness. The young chief sat with this, his pride still resisting somewhat, though something in him recognized the truth of what she was offering. "How did the chiefs before me handle this?" he asked. "Did they simply defer to the council on everything?" "No," she said. "A chief who defers on everything is not leading either. The skill is in knowing the difference, recognizing which decisions genuinely require swift, individual action, and which decisions benefit from the patience of gathering many perspectives before committing the whole village to a single path." "And this decision about relocating during the drought?" "This decision affects every family, every burial ground, every grazing right in the village," she said. This was never a decision meant for one person alone, however capable that person might be. The young chief called a full council the following week, setting aside his earlier plan, genuinely opening the floor to every voice willing to speak. The conversation was long, sometimes difficult, occasionally frustrating in its slowness compared to the swift, decisive action he had originally envisioned. But what emerged from that long council was a plan he could never have devised alone, a partial relocation that preserved access to ancestral grounds while still reaching better grazing land, negotiated carefully with the neighboring village rather than risking conflict, timed to protect the most vulnerable members of the community rather than rushing the entire group through dangerous conditions all at once. The plan worked. The village survived the drought with minimal loss, and the careful, collaborative process that produced the solution became, in later years, the model the young chief returned to again and again throughout his long leadership. He never stopped making swift decisions when swift decisions were genuinely needed, but he learned, through this early experience, the deeper strength available in trusting that his own certainty, however confident, was never the entire picture, and that true leadership sometimes meant having the humility to let a wiser, more complete answer emerge from many voices rather than insisting his own voice alone was sufficient. His grandmother, watching this unfold from the edge of the gathered council, said nothing further. She had said what was needed. The rest, she trusted, the young chief would continue learning on his own, the way all genuine wisdom is eventually learned, not through being told once, but through living it, again and again, until it finally became simply how he led. In the African philosophy of Ubuntu, there is a teaching that speaks directly to this same understanding of collective wisdom. Ubuntu is often summarized through the phrase, "I am because we are." The recognition that individual capability, however genuine, is never actually separate from the community that shapes and sustains it. A leader's wisdom in this understanding is never meant to function in isolation. It is meant to draw upon and contribute to a larger collective wisdom that no single person possesses alone. Traditional African governance structures in many communities reflect this understanding directly, often built around councils of elders whose collective deliberation, rather than any single ruler's individual decree, guides significant decisions affecting the whole community. This is not viewed as a limitation on leadership. It is viewed as leadership's proper, complete expression. There is a teaching often associated with Ubuntu philosophy that no person, however gifted, can see the whole truth alone. That truth itself is something assembled collectively through many partial perspectives joined together, rather than something any single mind, however capable, can perceive in its entirety. The young chief's grandmother was teaching him something Ubuntu philosophy has long understood. Genuine strength in leadership is rarely the strength of standing alone. It is the strength of recognizing how much fuller, how much wiser a decision becomes once it has been shaped by every voice the community has to offer. This understanding shapes not only governance, but everyday relationships across many African communities, where decisions affecting families or neighborhoods are often approached collectively rather than left to a single isolated voice, reflecting a deep cultural conviction that wisdom multiplies rather than dilutes when it is genuinely shared. Think about a decision you have been carrying entirely alone, certain that handling it solo was the responsible, capable approach. You may have felt this yourself, the particular exhaustion of believing that asking for input or sharing the weight of a decision would somehow diminish your own competence rather than strengthening the decision itself. This shows up in ordinary life in familiar ways. The project undertaken alone that could have benefited enormously from a colleague's different perspective, the major life decision made in isolation when a trusted friend might have seen something important that solitary deliberation simply could not reveal. The assumption that needing help is the same thing as failing to be capable, not. But you are not alone tonight, even in this quiet. You are part of something larger than your own single perspective, held by countless others who have lain down to rest exactly as you are now, carrying their own days, finding their own way toward this same stillness. Right now, in this breath, there is nothing you need to decide alone. You do not have to solve everything in your life through solitary effort tonight. You are allowed, even in this quiet, private moment, to trust that you are part of something larger than your own single perspective, and that this, too, is a kind of rest. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a kind of knowing that lives deeper than conscious thought, available to anyone willing to trust it. It does not arrive through frantic calculation. It arrives through years of patient attention, absorbed so completely into the body that it becomes available exactly when needed, without requiring constant anxious supervision from the conscious mind. Lao Tzu wrote that without going outside, one may know the whole world, suggesting that the deepest knowing is not always found through more searching, more effort, more frantic calculation, but through a quieter, more trusting attention to what the body and the moment already offer. Wu Wei, applied here, suggests that some of our most important decisions are best made not through forcing an answer, but through trusting the quieter knowing that patient training has already built within us. Tonight's 10th teaching is this: you already know more than your anxious, calculating mind gives you credit for. Sometimes the wisest action is simply to trust it. There was a young navigator training among her people who for many generations had crossed vast stretches of open ocean, guided not by instruments, but by an intimate, deeply trained relationship with the sea itself. She had studied diligently, memorizing star paths, learning to read the subtle behavior of clouds reflecting distant lagoons, training her body to feel the particular rhythm of ocean swells beneath the canoe. Her teacher, one of the most respected navigators of his generation, considered her among his most promising students. On what was meant to be a relatively simple training voyage between two familiar islands, an unexpected dense fog rolled in, obscuring not only the stars but the horizon itself, leaving her with no visible reference points at all. She felt panic rising immediately. Without the stars, without any visible landmark, she found herself reaching frantically for calculations, trying to reconstruct her position through careful, conscious reasoning. Distance traveled, estimated speed, the time elapsed since her last clear star sighting. The calculations, attempted under mounting anxiety, kept producing different, contradictory answers, each one less certain than the last. Her hands grew unsteady on the paddle. Her breathing grew shallow and rushed. She remembered then something her teacher had told her many months before, during a calm evening lesson on a quiet beach. "The stars are the clearest teacher," he had said, "but they are not the only one. Your body has been learning the ocean's other languages this entire time, whether you have consciously noticed it or not." She forced herself to stop the frantic mental calculations. She set down the anxious reasoning entirely, and instead simply sat still in the canoe, closing her eyes. Feeling. Beneath her, she felt the swell, a particular rhythmic pattern. She realized she had been feeling the entire voyage, the entire morning, without consciously attending to it. Her training, absorbed over years of patient practice, had been quietly tracking this rhythm the whole time, even while her conscious mind, now panicking, had been entirely focused elsewhere. She let her body's quieter knowing take precedence over her anxious mental calculations. She adjusted her course slightly, following the swell's subtle but consistent pattern, no longer trying to force a precise answer through frantic reasoning, but trusting instead the deeper sense that years of training had built within her. She paddled this way for nearly 2 hours, the fog showing no sign of lifting, her conscious mind occasionally flaring with doubt, each time gently returning her attention to the steady, trusted rhythm beneath the canoe, rather than allowing panic to reclaim control. When the fog finally began to thin, she found herself, to her quiet astonishment, almost precisely on course, far closer to her intended destination than her earlier frantic calculations had ever managed to suggest. She returned to her teacher and recounted the entire experience, the panic, the failed calculations, and finally the decision to trust her body's quieter knowing instead. Her teacher listened carefully, nodding slowly throughout her account. "You learned today what many navigators take years to learn," he said. "Not how to read the stars. You already knew that. You learned what to do when the stars are not available at all." "I almost did not stop calculating," she admitted. "It felt irresponsible to simply trust a feeling rather than careful reasoning." "It is not simply a feeling," he said. "It is trained knowing, built through years of patient attention, expressing itself without needing your conscious mind to supervise every detail. The calculating mind has its place, but it is not the only place wisdom lives. Sometimes the calculating mind, in its anxiety, actually obscures the very knowing it is trying so hard to produce. I worry, she said slowly, that next time I will not be able to tell the difference between trained knowing and simple panic dressed up as intuition. Her teacher nodded, acknowledging the genuine weight of this concern. That worry is itself a sign of wisdom, not a flaw. The two can feel similar in the moment, especially to someone still early in their training. But panic tends to feel scattered, urgent, grasping at many different answers at once. Trained knowing tends to feel quieter, steadier, even if it arrives without the certainty you might wish for. You will learn, gradually, to recognize the difference, the same way you learn to recognize the swell beneath your canoe, not all at once, but through patient, repeated attention. How do I know in the future when to trust the calculation and when to trust the quieter knowing? She asked. You will not always know with certainty, he admitted. Even after many years, I sometimes hesitate between the two. But you will learn, through practice, to recognize when your calculating mind has become anxious and unreliable, spinning without producing genuine clarity. And in those moments you will remember today, and you will trust that your training has already given you more than your anxious mind believes. She became, in the years that followed, one of the most respected navigators of her generation, known particularly for a remarkable calm during difficult crossings, a calm her own students eventually asked about, assuming she had simply been born with an unusually steady temperament. She always told them this same story instead. The fog, the failed calculations, the decision, finally, to trust the swell beneath the canoe rather than the frantic reasoning above it. In the wayfinding traditions of Polynesian navigators, this exact teaching has been passed down through countless generations of master navigators who crossed the vast Pacific Ocean using no instruments beyond their own deeply trained perception. Master navigators developed what is sometimes described as an integrated sense of direction, combining star paths, wave patterns, wind behavior, the flight paths of certain birds, and a deeply trained intuition that continued functioning even when the clearest signals, like visible stars, were temporarily unavailable. There is a principle in this tradition, sometimes described as holding the island in your mind. A navigator does not constantly search frantically for the destination outside themselves through conscious calculation alone. They hold a steady, trained internal sense of where the island lies, refined through years of patient practice, and trust that sense even through long stretches of open ocean where no visible landmark confirms it. This deeply trained, embodied knowing is not opposed to careful study. It is built upon careful study, accumulated over years until it becomes available without needing constant conscious supervision. The young navigator's panic in the fog arose precisely because she momentarily forgot this, reaching for frantic calculation instead of trusting the deeper knowing her training had already prepared her to access. Master wayfinders across the Pacific have long understood what this story illustrates directly. The deepest competence is not always the loudest, most consciously effortful kind. Sometimes it is the quietest kind, trained so thoroughly that it simply knows without needing to prove its knowing through anxious, visible struggle. This tradition of navigation, passed down through oral teaching across many generations, was never considered mystical or unexplainable. It was understood as the natural result of sustained, disciplined attention available to anyone willing to commit the years of practice required to develop it. Think about a time you trusted a quieter sense of knowing, rather than frantic calculation, and found it served you well. You may have felt this yourself, a decision that became clear not through exhaustive analysis, but through a quieter, more settled sense that arrived once you finally stopped anxiously calculating and simply paid attention to what you already somehow knew. This shows up in ordinary life in familiar ways, the route home your feet know without conscious thought, even while your mind is occupied elsewhere entirely. The answer to a difficult question that arrives, fully formed, the moment you stop straining toward it and let your attention rest somewhere quieter. The decision that felt right immediately, before any of the careful pro and con analysis you later perform to justify it. Not. But there is a swell beneath this moment too, quieter than thought, steady beneath whatever fog the day may have left behind. You do not need to see clearly tonight. You only need to trust it. Right now, in this breath, you do not need to calculate your way toward rest. Your body already knows how to do this. It has been doing it your entire life, long before you ever needed to consciously think about how. Trust it now, the way the young navigator finally trusted the swell beneath her canoe. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a kind of readiness that does not look like preparation at all. It does not arrive carrying every possible tool, anticipating every possible difficulty. It arrives instead deeply attuned to a particular place, trusting that attunement itself to provide what is actually needed when it is actually needed. Lao Tzu wrote that the sage travels without needing supplies because true preparation is not the accumulation of tools, but a deep alignment with the place and moment one finds oneself in. Wei suggests that sometimes our most exhausting preparations are simply evidence that we have not yet trusted our own attunement to the situation in front of us. Tonight's 11th teaching is this. Not all readiness looks like carrying more. Sometimes the deepest readiness is carrying less, and trusting your attunement to the moment to provide exactly what it requires. There was a young hunter, eager to prove himself to his community, who had grown accustomed to preparing extensively before every hunt. Multiple spears, elaborate traps, every tool he could imagine might possibly prove useful. His preparations, however thorough, often left him exhausted before the hunt itself had even properly begun, weighed down by the sheer volume of equipment he insisted on carrying. An elder of the community, known for hunting with remarkable success despite carrying almost nothing at all, agreed to take the young man out one morning, observing his methods directly. The young hunter arrived laden with spears, nets, several types of traps, certain this thorough preparation would impress the respected elder. The elder arrived carrying nothing but a single, simple digging stick. "Where is your spear?" the young hunter asked, genuinely confused. "I do not know yet what I will need today," the elder said simply. "The country will tell me once we are actually walking in it." They set out together, the young hunter struggling somewhat under the weight of his extensive equipment, the elder moving lightly, attentively, his eyes and ears clearly engaged with subtle details. The young hunter, focused on managing his cumbersome gear, was missing entirely. After some hours of walking, the elder paused suddenly, crouching low, gesturing for stillness. "What do you see?" the elder whispered. The young hunter looked around, seeing nothing obviously significant. "The grass there," the elder said, pointing subtly. "It has been disturbed recently in a pattern that suggests a wallaby passed through not long ago, moving toward the waterhole beyond that ridge." The young hunter looked more carefully and began slowly to notice the same subtle disturbance the elder had immediately recognized. "How did you see that?" he asked. "I have walked this same path many times and never noticed such details." "Because you are usually thinking about your equipment," the elder said gently, "about which spear to use, which trap might work best. Your attention is on what you are carrying rather than on what the country itself is actually showing you." They continued following the subtle signs, the elder occasionally pausing to demonstrate some other detail the young hunter had never learned to notice, the particular quality of bird calls signaling nearby movement, the way certain plants bent slightly differently when recently brushed against by a passing animal. Eventually, they came upon the wallaby resting near the waterhole exactly as the elder had predicted. "Now," the elder said quietly, "what do you need?" The young hunter, realizing he had been carrying 3 different types of spears specifically for this kind of situation, reached for what he judged the most appropriate. The elder instead picked up a single sturdy stick lying nearby, perfectly suited to the moment, and demonstrated a simple, effective technique requiring nothing more elaborate than that. You did not need to carry anything, the young hunter realized, somewhat astonished. The country provided exactly what was needed, right here, in this moment. "It usually does," the elder said, "if you are attentive enough to notice it, rather than so weighed down by your own preparations that you cannot see what is actually being offered." "But surely some preparation is wise," the young hunter said, still slightly resistant to abandoning his elaborate equipment entirely. "What if the country does not provide what is needed?" "Then you adapt in that moment with whatever genuine attention has already shown you," the elder said. "This is not carelessness. It requires far more skill than simply carrying every possible tool in advance. It requires knowing the country itself so intimately that you trust it to provide, the same way you trust your own hands to know how to grip something the moment you actually need to hold it." "That trust sounds difficult to build," the young hunter said. "I am not certain I know how to begin trusting something I cannot see in advance." "You build it the same way you built your skill with the spear," the elder said. "Slowly, through repeated practice, through paying attention each time rather than assuming you already know. You will not trust the country fully after a single walk like this one, but each time you walk attentively, rather than burdened by excessive preparation, the trust deepens slightly. Eventually it becomes simply how you move through the world. The way breathing becomes simply how you live. No longer something you must consciously remember to do. The young hunter walked home that evening carrying far less than he had carried that morning, though he felt, strangely, far more capable than he had felt with all his elaborate equipment weighing him down. He began, in the seasons that followed, gradually reducing what he carried on each hunt, trusting more and more in his growing attentiveness to the country itself rather than his accumulated equipment. His success did not diminish. If anything, it grew as his attention, no longer divided between managing his gear and reading the land, became fully available to what the country was actually showing him. He never abandoned tools entirely, but he learned through this single formative experience the difference between preparation that served him and preparation that simply weighed him down, distracting him from the deeper readiness that attentive presence itself could provide. He taught this same lesson to his own students decades later, walking them through the same country, watching them gradually learn to set down their excessive equipment and trust, instead, their own growing attunement to a land that had always been generously offering exactly what was needed, to anyone patient enough to actually notice it. Among Aboriginal peoples of Australia, there is a profound and ancient understanding of deep, attentive relationship with country. Not country as mere landscape, but as a living, responsive presence that offers what is needed to those who maintain genuine relationship with it. Traditional hunting and gathering practices across many Aboriginal nations reflect this understanding directly. Rather than imposing rigid plans onto the land, skilled practitioners develop deep, patient attentiveness to seasonal signs, animal behavior, and subtle environmental cues, trusting this attentiveness to guide appropriate action rather than relying primarily on elaborate advanced preparation. There is an understanding carried across generations in many Aboriginal traditions that knowledge of country is not separate from relationship with country, that true readiness comes not from accumulating tools or rigid plans, but from a quality of presence so attuned to a particular place that appropriate action becomes available naturally, as the situation actually requires it. This understanding extends to a broader principle sometimes described as walking lightly, carrying only what genuine necessity requires, trusting deep attentiveness and relationship with the land to provide the rest, rather than burdening oneself with excessive preparation that ultimately distracts from the very attentiveness it was meant to support. The elders' wisdom, walking with nothing but a simple digging stick, reflects this deep tradition directly. True preparation, in this understanding, is not what you carry. It is the quality of your attention to the place you are actually in. This understanding of country extends, in many Aboriginal traditions, into a broader relationship with knowledge itself. The conviction that the land holds wisdom not separate from human understanding, but deeply woven into it, available to anyone who approaches with sufficient patience, respect, and genuine attentiveness, rather than treating the land merely as a resource to be extracted from through force of effort alone. Think about something you have been over-preparing for, carrying far more physically, mentally, emotionally than the actual situation requires. You may have felt this yourself, exhausting yourself with elaborate contingency planning, certain that more preparation would bring more security, while the actual moment, when it arrived, asked for something simpler than all of your anxious preparation had anticipated. This shows up in ordinary life in familiar ways, the presentation over-rehearsed to the point of losing its natural ease, the trip packed with far more than was ever actually needed, weighing down the journey itself, the difficult conversation rehearsed so extensively in advance that you arrive unable to actually listen to what the other person is saying, too busy managing your own elaborate preparation. But you have arrived here tonight carrying many things from your day. You do not need to carry them any further. Set them down the way the hunter set down his spears, and notice how much lighter the rest of this moment becomes. Right now, in this breath, you do not need to prepare for sleep. You do not need a strategy, a technique, an elaborate plan. You only need to set down whatever you have been carrying and trust this moment exactly as it is to provide everything that is actually required. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a wisdom in understanding that some things unfold according to their own season, regardless of how urgently we might wish to hurry them. Forcing a harvest before the grain has ripened produces nothing but waste. The wisdom lies not in resisting the season, but in learning its rhythm closely enough to work with it rather than against it. Lao Tzu wrote that nature does not hurry, and yet everything is accomplished. Wu Wei asks us to consider that our own deepest accomplishments may also depend less on forcing speed and more on understanding and respecting the actual season each effort requires. Tonight's 12th teaching is this: some things cannot be rushed without ruining them. Learning to recognize which things these are may be one of the quietest, most valuable skills available to us. There was a young farmer who had inherited his family's fields during a season of considerable financial pressure, his household depending urgently on a strong harvest to see them through the coming year. His anxiety about the harvest's success led him to constantly intervene, watering excessively, testing the grain's ripeness daily, sometimes harvesting small portions early, simply to relieve his own mounting worry, even though he knew intellectually that early harvesting produced weaker, less valuable grain. An old farmer in the neighboring field, who had worked this same land for over 50 years, watched this anxious activity with quiet concern. One evening, the old farmer invited the young man to share a simple meal, and during their conversation, gently raised what he had been observing. "You are watering more than the grain needs," the old farmer said. I am trying to help it grow faster, the young man admitted. We need this harvest urgently. I cannot simply wait and hope. The grain does not grow faster because you water it more, the old farmer said. It grows precisely as fast as it is capable of growing, regardless of your anxiety. Excessive watering, in fact, can weaken the roots, making your situation worse rather than better. The young man felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same anxious urgency that had been driving his constant intervention all season. "Then what am I supposed to do?" he asked. "Simply watch and do nothing while my family's security depends on this harvest?" "Not nothing," the old farmer said, "but perhaps less than you currently believe is required. There is a season for planting, a season for tending, a season for waiting, and a season for harvest. Each season asks something different of you. Right now, in this particular season, what is asked of you is mostly patience, not more frantic intervention. How do I know when patience is appropriate and when more active effort is genuinely needed?" the young man asked. The old farmer considered this carefully. You learn to read the actual signs the crop itself is showing you, rather than simply acting on your own anxiety. The color of the grain, the particular way it moves in the wind when it is truly ready, different from how it moves when it is not. These signs exist. Your anxiety, unfortunately, often drowns them out. I worry that by the time I learn to read these signs reliably, an entire season, or several, may have already passed me by, with my family suffering the consequences of my inexperience, the young man said. This worry is understandable, the old farmer said, but consider this. Even an imperfect attempt at patient observation teaches you more than another season of pure, anxious intervention ever will. You are not choosing between perfect patience and continued anxiety. You are choosing between gradually improving your ability to read the land honestly or continuing to mistake your own fear for diligence indefinitely. The first path, however imperfect at the start, leads somewhere. The second simply repeats itself, season after season, without ever actually growing wiser. I have been so worried about failing, the young man admitted, that I have not actually been watching the crop closely. I've been watching my own fear instead. This is very common, the old farmer said, not unkindly, especially in young farmers facing real pressure for the first time. The fear feels productive. It feels like doing something. But fear and attentiveness are not the same thing. And sometimes fear actively prevents the very attentiveness that would serve you far better. The young man spent the following weeks practicing a different kind of attention, observing his fields carefully each morning, noting the actual changes in color and texture and movement, rather than reflexively watering or intervening out of anxious habit. It was difficult at first. The anxiety did not disappear simply because he understood intellectually that patience was wiser. Each day he resisted the urge to intervene required real, deliberate effort, not the effort of doing more, but the harder effort of doing less, of trusting a process he could not fully control. When harvest time finally arrived, precisely when the old farmer's careful observation had predicted, the grain proved stronger and more abundant than the young man's anxious early estimates had suggested it would be. His family's needs were met that year, not through more frantic effort, but through a more patient attentiveness that allowed the natural season to unfold as it was always going to, undisturbed by unnecessary intervention. The young farmer carried this lesson forward into many subsequent seasons. He did not become a passive farmer, simply waiting idly while crops grew on their own. He learned instead a more discerning kind of effort, knowing precisely when his intervention was genuinely needed and when his anxious need to feel productive was actually working against the very outcome he was trying to protect. He taught this lesson eventually to his own children, walking them through the same fields, helping them learn to distinguish between the fear that masquerades as diligence and the genuine attentiveness that actually serves a harvest's true, unhurried season. In the Mayan cosmological tradition, there is a profound and ancient understanding of cyclical time, deeply attentive to the natural rhythms and seasons that govern agricultural and spiritual life alike. The Maya developed an intricate calendar system tracking multiple overlapping cycles, agricultural seasons, celestial movements, ceremonial periods, each understood not as something to be rushed or forced, but as a rhythm to be respected, studied, and worked with patiently over generations. Maya agricultural practice, refined over centuries, reflected deep respect for the proper timing of planting, tending, and harvest, understanding that forcing any of these stages before its proper season produced weaker results than patiently honoring each phase's natural unfolding. There is a concept within Maya spiritual tradition, sometimes described through the understanding that each day, each cycle, carries its own particular energy and appropriate activity. A worldview that discourages forcing actions outside their natural timing, instead encouraging careful attentiveness to when a given action is genuinely appropriate and when patience is the wiser path. The old farmer's wisdom in our story, learned through decades of direct experience with the land, echoes this deep Maya understanding of cyclical, respected time. Some things cannot be hurried without damaging them. The skill is not in resisting this truth, but in learning to recognize with increasing clarity exactly which things these are. Maya communities historically maintained this relationship with time not as an abstract philosophy, but as a deeply practical discipline woven into the rhythms of daily agricultural and ceremonial life, ensuring that important undertakings, planting, building, even significant decisions, were approached with attentiveness to their proper season, rather than forced according to human impatience alone. Think about something in your life you have been trying to rush, perhaps out of genuine anxiety about an important outcome. You may have felt this yourself, the particular exhausting cycle of anxious intervention, certain that more activity, more effort, more visible doing would somehow accelerate a process that, in truth, required patience more than additional force. This shows up in ordinary life in familiar ways. The healing process, physical or emotional, that cannot be rushed no matter how urgently you wish it could be. The relationship still finding its proper footing, pushed too hard toward commitment or resolution before it was genuinely ready. The creative project checked anxiously, again and again, as though more frequent attention could somehow force inspiration to arrive sooner than it naturally would. Not. But whatever season you are in right now, tonight asks nothing more of you than to rest within it. The next season will arrive in its own time, exactly as it always has. Right now, in this breath, there is nothing to rush. Sleep has its own season tonight, its own natural unfolding that cannot be forced through anxious effort. You do not need to hurry it. You only need to trust that it is already, quietly, on its way. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a final teaching, perhaps the simplest of all the ones we have shared tonight, and yet the one that ties them all together. Every material, every situation, every person carries its own nature, its own particular way of bending, resisting, yielding, holding firm. The deepest mastery does not impose a single predetermined shape onto everything it touches. It learns, again and again, to recognize and work with whatever nature is actually present. Lao Tzu wrote that the great craftsman does few carvings, suggesting that the finest work often requires less imposition, not more. A willingness to let the material itself guide much of what unfolds, rather than forcing every detail according to a rigid, predetermined plan. This has been, in many ways, the whole of what Wei has been pointing toward across these 13 chapters. Not effortlessness as laziness, but effortlessness as deep, attentive alignment, accomplishing fully, while finally setting down the exhausting weight of constant, unnecessary force. Every story tonight in its own way has carried this same quiet thread. The carpenter feeling for the grain, the geese trusting their own timing, the weaver returning to her thread. Each one a different doorway into the same room. Tonight's final teaching is this: the work done in alignment with what is actually present is rarely the hardest work. It is, more often, simply the truest. There was a smith renowned throughout the northern lands for blades that never failed in battle, never cracked under pressure, never betrayed the warriors who carried them. A young apprentice, eager to learn his secret, watched him work for many months, noticing something curious. Unlike other smiths in the region, who hammered metal according to a single, consistent technique, regardless of what they were working with, this smith seemed to handle each piece of metal differently, as though listening to something the apprentice could not yet perceive. "Why do you not simply use the same technique each time?" the apprentice finally asked. "Surely consistency would be more efficient." The smith set down his hammer and considered the question seriously, as he considered most things. "Come," he said, "I will show you." He handed the apprentice 2 pieces of raw iron seemingly identical to the untrained eye. "Strike each one exactly the same way and tell me what you notice." The apprentice did as instructed. The first piece responded predictably, taking the shape he intended with reasonable ease. The second piece struck identically, cracked slightly along an edge, resisting the same force the first piece had readily accepted. "They are not the same," the apprentice said, surprised. "I thought all iron was simply iron." "All iron is iron," the smith agreed. "But not all iron has been through the same fire, the same cooling, the same history before it ever reached your hands. This piece," he said, indicating the cracked one, "was cooled too quickly during its initial smelting. It carries a particular brittleness now, a memory of that hasty cooling that no amount of skilled hammering will entirely erase." "Then it is ruined?" the apprentice asked. "Not ruined," the smith said, "simply different. It cannot become the same blade the other piece might become, but it can become something else, something equally valuable, if you are willing to work with what it actually is, rather than forcing it toward a shape it was never going to hold." "How do you know what it can become?" the apprentice asked. "I listen," the smith said. "Not with my ears, with my hands, with my hammer, with years of attention to how different metals respond under different conditions. Every piece tells you, eventually, what it is willing to become, if you are patient enough to notice, rather than simply imposing your own predetermined plan onto it, regardless of what it is actually showing you." "Is this something that can be taught?" the apprentice asked. "Or is it simply a gift some smiths are born with and others are not?" The smith considered the question seriously. "I was not born with this. I learned it slowly, over many years, through countless mistakes, blades that cracked because I forced them, blades that never achieved their full potential because I gave up on them too early, assuming they could become nothing more than I initially expected. The listening is not magic. It is simply patient attention, repeated so many times that it eventually becomes second nature, the way your own hand now knows how to hold a hammer without your conscious mind directing every motion." The apprentice spent the following months learning this kind of attention, gradually developing the capacity to sense, before the first strike of his hammer, something of what a particular piece of metal might be willing to yield. It was slower work at first than simply following a fixed technique regardless of the material, but the results, gradually, began to show a quality his earlier, more uniform efforts had never achieved. Blades that held their edge longer, that bent under pressure rather than cracking, that seemed somehow more completely themselves than blades forced into shape without this deeper attentiveness. One winter, a warrior came to the smith requesting a blade for an upcoming dangerous campaign, offering considerable payment for the finest weapon the smith could produce. The smith selected, after careful consideration, not the most pristine, easily worked iron in his stock, but a piece that had endured a particularly harsh history, multiple firings, considerable impurities, a complexity that a less attentive smith might have rejected entirely as too difficult to work with. "Why this piece?" the apprentice asked, genuinely curious. "Surely the cleaner iron would be easier and safer for such an important commission?" "Easier, yes," the smith said, "but this piece, despite its difficult history, or perhaps because of it, carries a particular strength the cleaner iron does not possess. It has already been tested by fire many times over. What remains is not fragile. It is proven. The blade that emerged from this difficult piece of iron became, in time, one of the finest weapons the smith ever produced, not despite the metal's complicated history, but because the smith had been patient and attentive enough to work with that history rather than against it. The apprentice, watching this entire process unfold, finally understood what had eluded him at the very beginning of his training. Mastery was never about imposing a single, predetermined shape onto every piece of metal that came through the forge. It was about developing the patience and attentiveness to recognize what each particular piece, with its particular history, was actually capable of becoming, and the wisdom to work with that truth, rather than constantly fighting against it. In the Norse mythological tradition, craftsmanship itself carries deep symbolic and spiritual weight, perhaps most vividly embodied in the dwarven smiths who forged many of the most significant treasures in the old sagas. These legendary craftsmen were not depicted as simply imposing brute force onto raw materials. Their mastery was understood as a deep, almost mystical attunement to the particular nature of what they worked with. Gold, iron, the bones of mythical creatures, each material requiring its own particular understanding, its own particular patience, before it could be transformed into something of genuine, lasting value. The forging of Mjolnir, the hammer wielded by the god Thor in Norse mythology, involved careful, attentive craftsmanship rather than careless or hurried force. And even then, the saga notes a small flaw in the handle, a reminder that even the finest craftsmanship works within, rather than entirely against, the inherent nature and limitations of what it shapes. There is a broader principle in Norse tradition, reflected throughout the sagas, that true strength is rarely found in forcing one's will onto the world without regard for the world's own nature. The wisest figures in these old stories are typically those who understand the materials, the seasons, the temperaments of both metal and men, working skillfully within these realities rather than against them. The smith in our story, listening carefully to what each piece of iron was actually capable of becoming, reflects this old Norse understanding of craftsmanship directly. The finest work was never about overpowering the material. It was about understanding it deeply enough to finally work with it. This same principle echoes throughout Norse wisdom literature beyond craftsmanship alone, suggesting that the wisest people, like the wisest smiths, learn to recognize the particular nature of whatever they encounter, season, circumstance, or fellow person, and to work skillfully within that nature, rather than exhausting themselves attempting to impose a single will onto a world that was never going to yield to force alone. Think about something or someone in your life that you have been trying to force into a shape it was never actually suited to hold. You may have felt this yourself, exhausting yourself trying to impose a single predetermined plan onto a situation, a relationship, or even your own particular nature, rather than pausing to ask what that situation, that person, that part of yourself was actually capable of becoming. This shows up in ordinary life in familiar ways. The career path pursued because it seemed the expected shape, rather than the shape your own particular nature was genuinely suited to. The friendship or family relationship strained by expecting it to look like a different, more conventional relationship rather than honoring the unique form it has actually taken. The parts of yourself you have spent years trying to hammer into a more convenient shape, rather than finally listening to what they were actually telling you about who you are. But whatever history brought you to this exact moment tonight, it has not damaged you beyond what rest can reach. You are like the smith's most valuable iron, proven rather than fragile, exactly as you are. Right now, in this breath, there is nothing you need to force into a different shape. You are exactly the particular piece of iron you have always been, carrying your own particular history, your own particular strength. Tonight, you do not need to become anything else. You only need to rest, exactly as you are. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Tonight we began with Wu Wei, and over these 13 chapters we let that question open slowly from many different sides. We watched a carpenter stop forcing the grain and learn to feel for the shape that was already there. We stood beside a marsh and watched wild geese take flight at exactly the right moment with no plan at all. We sat with a young commander who learned that restraint can be the clearest evidence of strength. We followed a weaver who finally set down her anxious grasping and rediscovered the simple pleasure of the thread in her hands. We met a monk with a single bowl who wanted for nothing at all. We waited beside a locksmith's swollen lock, learning that some things cannot be rushed, only allowed their proper time. We watched an archer miss for years by trying too hard, and finally strike true the moment he stopped. We found water not where it was convenient, but where the green moss had been quietly showing us the whole time. We sat in a council where one voice became wiser by joining many others. We trusted a navigator's hands to feel a swell her frightened mind could not calculate. We walked beside a hunter who carried nothing and found that the country provided everything. We learned a harvest's patience from a farmer who finally stopped watering his own fear. And we watched a smith listen to what each piece of iron was actually capable of becoming. Now let us be clear about something. You are not your striving. You are not the constant anxious effort you have mistaken for so long as the only proof of your own worth. You are not the forcing. You are not the grasping. You are not the exhausting belief that rest must be earned before it can finally be allowed. You are the awareness that has been listening to all of these stories. You are the stillness beneath the striving. You are the quiet that was here before tonight began and will remain when this voice stops. You are the smith's iron, already enough, already carrying exactly the strength your own particular history has given you, needing nothing more imposed upon you tonight. The central thesis offered across these 13 chapters is simply this. We have been taught our entire lives that worth comes from effort and struggle. Wu Wei offers a different, older truth. The things that matter most often arrive not through force, but through alignment. patience, and the willingness to act only when action is natural and needed. This does not mean effort has no place. The carpenter still cut the wood, the weaver still wove the cloth, the farmer still tended his fields. But each of them discovered in their own way that the deepest, truest version of their work arrived only once they stopped forcing it and started listening instead. This is not a lesson to master once and then carry perfectly forever. Like every teaching shared tonight, it returns again and again, asking to be relearned in each new season, each new difficulty, each new moment that tempts you back toward force rather than alignment. That returning is not failure. It is simply how the practice actually works. You do not need to remember everything you heard tonight. If one moment stayed with you, one phrase, one feeling, let that be enough. Wherever you are right now, you are welcome here, exactly as you are, with whatever you are carrying and whatever you are ready to set down. Sleep well.